today we're discussing a recent decision by a military tribunal about vaccine mandates. Remember those? While the government mandates for COVID-19 vaccines are pretty much over, litigation over those mandates has continued. And there was a recent fascinating decision by the Military Grievance External Review Committee that found the policy of mandatory vaccines in the Canadian Armed Forces was unconstitutional. This committee heard the case because they'd received grievances from a number of armed forces members who had faced discipline, up to and including discharge, for refusing to get vaccinated or refusing to disclose their vaccination status. There were many cases dealing with vaccine mandates and the Constitution in Canada throughout the pandemic era, and many of those cases were dismissed on procedural grounds. This is a rare case where the tribunal actually found that a mandate was unconstitutional. Here today to discuss this groundbreaking decision is my colleague, Counsel for the Canadian Constitution Foundation, Josh Dehaas. Josh, thanks so much for joining me. First, let's step back a little in time to a pretty bad time, I guess, this mid 2021, 22 era. I remember the vaccine mandates, but how did the vaccine mandate for Canada's military actually work?
You'll probably recall that there weren't a lot of mandates in place back in 2021, but what happened was in the summer of 2021, we had this big national debate about whether there should be, vaccine passports and vaccine mandates. And Prime Minister Justin Trudeau decided he was going to have an election on this issue. And he said if he was reelected, he would put in place vaccine mandates for the entire federal workplace. And so he won that election. And one of the first things that he did was put that directive in place that said pretty much everybody in this federal workplace has to be mandated. And so the Canadian forces decided that they had to have a vaccine mandate too. And it's important to note here that 90% of the military members and staff had already received a vaccine by the time they decided to do this mandate. But they originally said in this directive in the fall of 2021, get the vaccine or you might face some problems in this organization, getting promoted and things like that. And the deadline was set to be November 15th. And then in early November, they sort of upped the ante and they said, you might be, facing even more serious discipline if you don't get the vaccine. And then by February 2022, they said basically, if you don't get this vaccine and you don't have some sort of accommodation like religious accommodation, you're going to be kicked out of the military. And they started that process. There were more than 1,200 people at one point facing
Wow.
potential discipline over this. And in the end, they decided to release at least 300 members, some of them voluntarily, but most of them involuntarily.
Wow. And that's a really big deal because I know recruitment is always a big issue for Canada's armed forces. Now, I'd also like to emphasize that this mandate, I mean, notwithstanding what the tribunal found, it was actually more flexible than some of the government mandates for civilians, which required you to get vaccinated to enter certain public spaces. And we can talk about that. But one of the cases that we've been involved in at the Canadian Constitution Foundation is a vaccine mandate in British Columbia that didn't even have these exemptions for medical reasons or for religious or conscientious reasons that the Canadian Armed Forces seem to. So, we've only got a minute. At a really high level, what did the tribunal find? And we can continue this after the break.
Yeah, so the basic finding is that this vaccine mandate was unconstitutional. It was a violation of people's Section 7 rights, which is the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, and to not be denied thereof except in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. And essentially, your decision about whether to take a medical treatment or not, that is covered by the right to liberty, and your bodily integrity is covered by the right to security of the person. So when somebody is saying you have to be injected with a drug that you don't want, that's an obvious implication for your right to security of the person. And they also found that this was not a limit that could be upheld under Section 1 of the Charter, which is the section that allows for limits where it's demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society.
Yeah, as we've discussed on this show many times, it's not enough for for the court or tribunal just to find that a right was limited. They also need to show that that limit was not justified. That's section 1 of the charter. We've got to go to commercial break, but when we come back, we'll talk about this more.